Hey, and welcome to another episode of Ghost Countries. This week, we're going to ancient Greece, more specifically, Epirus. For more episodes like this, be sure to subscribe down below, click the bell for all notifications, and yeah, that's it. The historic region of Epirus is now split between Albania and Greece, stretching from the Ceraunian Mountains in the north to the Ambracian Gulf in the south. Its eastern boundary is, nowadays, generally considered the Pindus Mountains, but once extended as far as Thessaly. To its west lies the Ionian Sea and the island of Corfu, which is usually not considered part of Epirus itself. A bit of an interesting side note here. The name Epirus, which comes from the Greek word for mainland, likely has its roots in the Indo-European word for coast, which in this case referred to the lands immediately opposite Corfu and the Ionian Islands. So there you go. Rugged and mountainous, Epirus was, geographically speaking, on the edge of the Greek world. Which raises an important question. Were the people of Epirus considered Greek? Well, it kinda depends on who you ask. The Epirotes themselves, who spoke a regionalized dialect of Greek, probably would have said yes, but if you ask some people from the Peloponnese, they would have disagreed. For them, even the Macedonians were barbarians, a term used for basically all people who did not speak proper Greek and or follow traditional Greek customs. Long story short, it's kind of complicated. The first signs of early settlement in Epirus date back to roughly 1600 BC, but information is sparse during this period. That being said, there is evidence suggesting an ancestral link between Epirus and the Mycenaean civilization, most notably in the usage of certain burial practices like tumuli, earthen mounds, and shaft graves. Linguists also believe Epirus may have formed part of the Proto-Greek linguistic area from which all Greek varieties emerged during the late Neolithic. Between 700 and 650 BC, most of the major Epirote population centers were founded, the most important of them being Ambracia, modern Arta, which served as a major trade center with Greek city-states down south. One of the oldest oracles of the Greek world was also located in Epirus, the Oracle of Dodona. Mentioned in the Trojan Wars, it was then regarded as second only to the Oracle of Delphi. Many myths originated about Dodona, which itself may date back to the 2nd millennium BC, and in many ways, the shrine/oracle came to serve as the cultural and political center for Epirus. However, unlike most other Greeks of this period, the inhabitants of Epirus generally lived in smaller villages when compared to the vast polis of the south. But who exactly were the people living in Epirus during this time? Generally speaking, they were split into three major tribes: the Chaonians, not Chelonians, up north, the Thesprotans,
little thing, little thing,
down south, and the Molossians in the center. These three tribes were constantly vying for dominance over each other, but later merged into a single people over the next few decades. Culturally, they were quite similar to the Illyrians, a neighboring Paleo-Balkan people to the north. They had an ambiguous relationship with the Greek city-states, but nonetheless, Epirus featured prominently in various Hellenian myths and legends. And what do nearly all Greek city-states have in common? Founding myths from the times of the Trojan War. The Molossians claimed to be the heirs of Achilles, while the other tribes asserted, respectively, they were the descendants of a Trojan prince, not unlike Rome. The Epirotes would later adopt the Greek alphabet sometime around the 6th century BC, but even a century later, they were still not considered legitimate Greeks. And perhaps this has more bearing in a year like 2020. Because of this, they were not allowed to participate in the Olympic Games. The Epirotes were also not invited to a Pan-Hellenic Congress in 448 BC, organized by the Athenian leader Pericles.
Go on, leave, get out!
But I didn't do anything!
Next!
But despite being labeled wannabe Greeks, over the following century, Epirus achieved a level of Hellenization in which they were no longer looked upon as mere outsiders. During the Peloponnesian War, for example, the Epirotes allied themselves with many different factions, most of them centering around Sparta. This conflict essentially can be considered a sort of ancient Greek world war, because the entire Hellenic world found itself involved, one way or another. And while this subject is a bit outside the scope of this episode, the basic gist is Athens and Sparta fought a nearly 30-year-long war for hegemony over the Greek world that proved devastating, especially for Athens and the other city-states in the Delian League. The Epirotes fought in the western theater of the war, sieging Amphilochia and Acarnania. The Chaonians were the dominant faction in Epirus during this time. However, in 370 BC, it was the Molossians that were ultimately able to create the first centralized state in Epirus, the Epirote League. The Molossian Iaki dynasty wasted no time expanding their influence at the expense of rival tribes, and soon allied themselves with the increasingly powerful kingdom of Macedon. This development was partially influenced by a common threat both states faced, namely that of Illyrian cross-border raids, and essentially resulted in Epirus becoming a vassal of Macedon. It, of course, was not an unbeneficial arrangement. Philip II, king of Macedon, would in 357 BC marry a princess from Epirus named Olympias. She later became the mother of perhaps one of history's most well-known conquerors, Alexander the Great. And his uncle, Alexander the Molossian, took the title King of Epirus for the first time in 359 BC. A few decades later, in 334 BC, when Alexander the Great headed east to conquer the Persian Empire, Alexander the Molossian headed west to support the Greek city-states in southern Italy under threat from various Italic tribes, including the Lucanians and Bruttians. His military campaign, however, was unsuccessful, and he died at the Battle of Pandosia in 331 BC. His cousin, Iakides of Epirus, took the throne following his death. So we all know what happened with Alexander the Great. He attacked the Persian Empire, routed their armies, and extended the borders of the Hellenic world from Macedonia and Epirus in the west to Egypt in the south and India in the far east. But in 323 BC, he suddenly died without a legitimate heir to take his throne. What followed was a power struggle, and his vast empire was divided amongst his generals, friends, and family, the so-called Diadochi. Among the major actors, Lysimachus took Thracia, Antigonos got Asia Minor, Seleucus got all the territories from Armenia to the Indian border, Cassander got Macedonia, and Ptolemy got Egypt, along with most of Arabia. This basically is a condensed version of events, and the actual wars of the Diadochi are deserving of their own episode. The long and short being, Alexander the Great's empire was partitioned, and this led to a whole new series of conflicts between rival claimants. However, let's get back to Epirus. Iakides of Epirus eventually found himself in conflict with Cassander, the king of Macedon and de facto ruler of much of southern Greece. The primary cause here was Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great. Just before Alexander's death in 323 BC, his wife, a Bactrian princess named Roxana, gave birth to Alexander IV. Olympias, Roxana, and Alexander IV allied themselves with Polyperchon, the intended successor who had been driven out of power by Cassander following the transition of power in Macedon. Their armies fought alongside Iakides, who allied himself with their cause. However, after some initial victories, Olympias was besieged at Pydna in 316 BC. Olympias, Roxana, Alexander IV, and even a supposed illegitimate son of Alexander the Great were eventually killed by Cassander, even though he had previously promised to spare their lives. Another side note here, but the Macedonian soldiers under Cassander actually refused to harm Olympias, since she was the mother of Alexander the Great, and rather, she was stoned to death by the enraged families of those whose lives who had been destroyed because of her bid for power. Following this, the Epirotes, exhausted from war, drove Iakides out of power, and he was forced to leave Epirus in 317 BC. 4 years later, disillusioned with Macedonian rule, they recalled Iakides, but he died in battle. A puppet king was then installed in Epirus, but in 307 BC he was dethroned by the Epirotes, and the son of Aeacides, Pyrrhus, returned to Epirus from exile. Pyrrhus had a rough start. At just 13 years of age, he became king in 306 BC, but upon turning 17, he was dethroned yet again by Cassander. In 297 BC, he became king of Epirus again, thanks in no small part to support from Ptolemy of Egypt. In his absence, however, the Molossians proclaimed another king, Neoptolemus. This in turn caused a civil war in which Pyrrhus emerged victorious. Over the following years, Pyrrhus fought against Macedonia and was able to gain a lot of territory in Greece, basically erasing Macedonia from the map for a while, although he was assisted by other Diadochi here. One of them, Lysimachus of Thracia, then declared war on him to obtain his newly acquired Macedonian territories, and in this regard he was successful, but Epirus itself was not conquered or vassalized. In 280 BC, the still young king was lured into yet another conflict, this time with Rome. He experienced success at the Battle of Heraclea, and following this, he almost managed to march on Rome before having to retreat. Thereafter, he went to Apulia, where the Battle of Asculum took place in 279 BC. And maybe you already guessed it, but this is where he won his now infamous Pyrrhic Victory, meaning a victory that is so destructive to the victor that it is tantamount to a defeat. And when looking at the numbers from the battle, and taking into account that the Romans could easily replenish their forces, you can see why. Plutarch, a Roman historian, cited Pyrrhus as saying, "If we are victorious in just one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." The man did love his war elephants, though. Even though Pyrrhus was a skillful general, his victories came with increasingly high costs that more often than not outweighed their strategic benefits. In addition, he began to act in an increasingly despotic manner, which cost him much of his remaining popular support in southern Italy. Without technically having lost any battle, he nonetheless abandoned his campaign in 275 BC, resulting in the loss of all territories he had previously gained. Back in Epirus, though, his military adventurism didn't stop. He declared war on the newly crowned king of Macedon, routed his army, and then declared himself king of Macedon instead. Shortly thereafter, he marched on the Peloponnese, where he assisted a claimant to the throne of Sparta. After some initial victories, this military venture turned into a disaster, and Pyrrhus died at the Battle of Argos in 272 BC, when an enemy soldier's mother threw a roof tile, knocking him off his horse, breaking his spine and paralyzing him. Whether Pyrrhus was actually dead after this blow is still a matter of contention, but he certainly was dead after a passing Macedonian soldier beheaded his motionless body. The peace treaty that followed this blunder could have been disastrous, but the now returned king of Macedon went easy on Epirus, knowing that he needed them as a buffer to prevent raiding by the Illyrians to the north. So Epirus kept its independence. The following years, though, were rough for Epirus. Social tension, pressure from outside powers, and a deeply unpopular alliance with the Macedonians weakened the state as a whole. In 233 BC, the last member of the Achaemenid dynasty, the Damia, was murdered. A new federal republic was then founded, although some territories in the south were lost, and a new capital was established at Phoenice. This new republic strengthened the three tribes' positions again, which had been minimized during the kingdom. Essentially what you had here were three quasi-independent republics unified in a league. And, though weakened, the Epirote League was still nonetheless an important power in ancient Greece. So, who became the next hegemon? Athens and Sparta had more or less lost their dominance some 200 years ago. The Macedonians were still powerful, but nowhere near the level under Philip II or Alexander the Great. So, for a while it seemed like one of the Diadochi would capitalize on the regional power vacuum. But while busy fighting each other, they didn't perceive a looming threat in the west, the Roman Republic. Rome involved itself in Greece after the Macedonians allied themselves to Hannibal Barca of Carthage, and the Second Punic War began. Epirus, however, opted to stay neutral, and even did so during the Second Macedonian War in 200 BC. In 172 BC, Rome and Macedon clashed in the Third Macedonian War, which also marked the end of the Epirote League. During this conflict, the three tribes actually sided with different factions. The Molossians fought alongside the Macedonians, whereas the Chaonians and Thesprotanes sided with the Romans. Wallachia was conquered by Rome in 167 BC, and some 150,000 people were enslaved. This effectively marked the end of the independent state of Epirus. Afterwards, the Romans took possession of Macedonia, dividing it into 4 client republics and establishing a permanent foothold in the Greek world. That being said, Epirus would actually reappear on a few occasions throughout history. For instance, when the Byzantine Empire fell into disarray during the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the despotate of Epirus regained its independence. That is, until the Ottomans entered the scene in the 15th century. There was also the very short-lived Autonomous Republic of Northern Epirus in 1914. But these are stories for another day. Thanks again for watching this episode of Ghost Countries. While many people know about other ancient Greek powers like Athens, Sparta, or Macedonia, Epirus remains something of a black sheep. It obviously never reached the same level as those I just mentioned, but nonetheless played an important role in the ancient Greek world, serving as a bridge to the Peloponnese to the south and the other people north and west of the Hellenic world. And I think it's probably one of the best Greek states from Rome to Total War. I mean, not only do you get 2 regions right off the bat, but with Village Confederation, that's a plus 20 for wealth from minor settlements, plus with Guardians of Dodona, you got a public order bonus of like plus 6 from the presence of Hellenic culture. It's not bad at all, in my opinion anyway. And yeah, that's where we got the flag from for this episode, since there really wasn't a national symbol like that back in the times of ancient Greece, per se. But in all seriousness, perhaps the reason Epirus was never able to become as influential or powerful as Sparta, Athens, Macedon, was that it remained fractured. The 3 tribes, while in league with each other at various times, were always looking to one-up each other. And this constant tribalism within the Epirote League or kingdom was a constant factor that undermined any success it achieved. And as we saw in the latter half of its history, undermined its very existence. Anyway, thanks again guys. Please like, share, and comment on the video. Check out our others if you haven't done so already, and please subscribe to our channel. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Peace.